All right, let's start you off in Japan, where G7 foreign ministers discussed the Ukraine conflict and the Israel-Hamas war. Leaders voiced support for humanitarian pauses and corridors, but not a ceasefire in Gaza. At the same time, saying that their support to Kyiv will never waver. In a joint statement, the leaders underlined the need for urgent action to address the deteriorating condition in Gaza, supporting Israel's right to defend itself.
紛争のさらなるエスカレーションや、より広い地域への拡大を防ぐ必要があること。6つ目、ガザの持続可能な長期的解決に取り組むことや、二国家解決が公正で永続的な平和への唯一の道であることなどで一致しました。
Well, what we need is we need to see a leadership of the Palestinian people that is genuinely committed to a peaceful two-state solution. Hamas are committed to the eradication of the State of Israel. From the UK's point of view, that is unacceptable. We want to see a Palestinian state and an Israeli state side by side, living in peace, prosperous, and working well with each other.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has reacted to Israeli Prime Minister's plans for Gaza after the war. Blinken has called on Israel to not reoccupy once the war with Hamas ends. The foreign ministers also warned Iran not to escalate tensions in the region and stop supporting groups like Hamas and the Lebanese Hezbollah. Meanwhile, on the Ukraine war, the group reiterated their long-standing support for Ukraine. The foreign ministers also urged China to stop supporting Russia in the conflict, while adding that they support China's participation. P. Joseph, Senior Fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and a foreign policy analyst. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Edward, good morning and great to see you again. Why is Antony Blinken saying that Israel should not reoccupy Gaza once the war is over? And does this have anything to do with the Arab world's opposition to Israel's possible move?
I think, Susan, first, good to be with you again as well. And it's very clear that Secretary Blinken is very focused, highly focused, first of all, on addressing the humanitarian crisis that in Gaza that's affecting so many Palestinian civilians. And he's trying to do this in cooperation with G7 allies. This is so important, what your report mentioned, and that report that did not call, as WION correctly stated, that report did not call for a ceasefire. And he's cautioning, Blinken is cautioning Prime Minister Netanyahu not to even consider a reoccupation of Gaza because the U.S. sees this as completely counterproductive. And of course, many Israelis also do and also understand. The question, of course, is open as to what arrangements, what the self-government would be for Palestinians once Hamas leaves. And here, Susan, it's very important to note that it's not just the G7. There is sustained consensus that Hamas must go. And I would point out here the statement on Sunday by Bernie Sanders, the left-wing progressive leader, who used those very words, that Hamas must go, while also, of course, Sanders warned and cautioned about Israeli attacks that are, of course, hitting and striking Palestinian civilians. And here, the G7 also, Susan, worth noting that Hamas has responsibility. The G7 calling for the release of the hostages, and it cannot be stated enough that if Hamas would release those 200 plus Israeli hostages, this would all be over, and there would be no suffering for Palestinian civilians. Please.
Yeah, I think it gets just lost in the conversation that Hamas could just end this tomorrow. But the Secretary of State also says that a ceasefire is impossible. As you mentioned, so do some people like Bernie Sanders here in the United States. So basically, they both say that this plays into Hamas's hand and Hamas will just buy time to wreak more havoc. But would a so-called humanitarian pause help bring the hostages home?
That we don't know. That depends, of course, on negotiations, presumably led either by Egypt or Qatar or both. And we just don't know that. But we do know that if Hamas would release the hostages, we do know that that would be that would end the fighting, surely for now. I would point out here a former chief of Israeli military intelligence has stated that if Hamas would release the hostages and leave, if Hamas leadership would leave, as he noted from prior experience in the Middle East, he states the war would be over. Not just the current situation, but he states the war, in fact, would be over at that point. Here, though, we have to talk about the urgent need to focus on the plight of so many Palestinian civilians, thousands of whom have been killed, many of them Palestinian children. Terrible situation. And these Palestinian civilians, of course, are trapped. They're trapped in a deadly situation where Hamas wants to exploit their vulnerability, exploit the vulnerability of Palestinian civilians. And it was interesting, the G7 statement noticed the importance of establishing corridors and emphasized the importance of civilian movement. And here, Susan, this is the element that has not received enough attention, including from humanitarian organizations like International Committee of the Red Cross, that has said, look, we can't operate anymore in Gaza. This is very important. Civilian movement, allowing these trapped Palestinian civilians to voluntarily depart the fighting in Gaza for sanctuary in Egypt, primarily, possibly even within Israel. And this is really one of the elements here the G7 has called attention to. And I would just mention here, particularly for your viewers in South Asia, that we see in Pakistan, we see not voluntary departure of vulnerable civilians. We see Pakistan forcing hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees out of the country, according to the Washington Post, under consistent police harassment and abuse. That's a quote from the Washington Post. And the Washington Post reports that this is a form of, by Pakistan, a form of collective punishment. This is exactly what Pakistan's ambassador to the UN has accused Israel of. So it's very important for leadership in the international community to have a consistent standard about protection of vulnerable civilians. Please.
Yeah, and I guess a light at the end of the tunnel and good news was that the G7 actually came out with a statement and they had consensus, at least on some issues. Edward P. Joseph, it's always great to talk to you. Thank you for your analysis, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.